Welcome to today's discussion in the Global Classroom on diseases and cities. Uh, Before we begin discussing specifically the role of diseases and cities, let us briefly review the history of disease as it affected human history over the last 10,000 years or so. Before human settlements, infectious diseases were very rare. As soon as we had farming and the associated increase in population size resulting in larger settlements, early cities, infectious diseases became a real issue. Furthermore, the majority of infectious diseases affecting humans, even today, come from domesticated animals. Now, while this happened in individual instances, those early settlements were also connected through trade routes, and that led eventually to a merger and an aggregation of disease pools of infectious diseases. As soon as cities grew in size, and we are now talking about the early empires, the Roman, Chinese, Indian Empire, but also the Inca and Maya Empire in the Americas, the major cities of those empires became an even bigger aggregate for infectious diseases and disease pools. Furthermore, those big cities, many of them did not live up to any of the sanitation requirements that we are used to today, at least in the West, uh, further aggravating the disease burden in those cities. Another important step in the history of disease or disease in human history comes with the discovery of new worlds. The most prominent is the so-called Columbian Exchange across the Atlantic that led to the expansion of the European disease pool into the Americas with often catastrophic results, but also later, particularly in the 19th century, with the expansion of European, British foremost empire into areas of Africa and Asia. The disease burden in form of tropical diseases had dramatic impacts on the Western Empire. Now, by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, we are entering a phase of a globalized world, a complete merger of disease pools through trade routes, and we can see that also in, for instance, global pandemics, cholera, the flu of 1918 as some of the examples. Once infectious diseases were more effectively combated, with the rise of vaccines in particular, another important aspect plays a role, namely the role of nutrition and sanitation in trying to prevent diseases. We see this together with the combating of infectious diseases with the advent of a dramatic increase in life expectancy, particularly in Western countries. That began in the early 20th century. Now, imperialism and disease is a very important topic that we won't have much time to touch here at all, but it basically has a lot to do with how British or Western army and trade outposts in the tropics encountered diseases that were so far unknown to those Western people, and furthermore, those diseases then also led to the advent of tropical medicine, major discoveries that helped us to understand infectious diseases, such even complicated infectious diseases, such as malaria. Now, in the Western world, 19th and 20th century, what we see is a gradual shift from the role of infectious diseases to the role of more systemic diseases, such as heart disease and cancer, largely because we had more effective ways of dealing with infectious disease. This dramatically affected the role of medicine and medical theory and medical research, among other things, but it also had dramatic effects on the financial burdens of healthcare systems. People tend to live longer, they have more complex, long-term diseases such as cancer, Alzheimer's disease, other degenerative diseases, and that right now creates the highly problematic financial system that makes our healthcare rather unsustainable. Now what we also see, and that's the last part of this disease history in 9 very crude steps, is that in our current period of rapid globalization, and because we basically have through overuse and set in motion evolutionary dynamic that makes most of our antibiotics, for instance, ineffective, what we see is the emergence of new and old infectious diseases that can now spread across the globe at a much more rapid pace than ever before. Plus, with the movement into cities, particularly in the developing world, we see the accumulation of huge cities without Western standards of sanitation at the border of tropical rainforests that are a reservoir for a whole number of newly emerging infectious diseases. And those can then, of course, spread through our means of transportation, so the networks of transportation and trade across the world at a rapid pace. So we are actually entering a very dangerous phase in our human history. There are 4 arguments we want to make, and we just review them ever so briefly, and they will become clear throughout the presentation and also in the reading. The first is, which you probably have already guessed, is that diseases had a crucial role in shaping human history. And furthermore, diseases, particularly infectious diseases, have always been linked closely to the emergence of cities. So diseases and cities are linked in human history. Second, prevailing disease patterns, that means the dominating diseases of a given period, influence medical theory and practice much more than the reported success of medicine managed to even change those disease patterns. In other words, doctors are pretty much useless throughout the history of medicine. What really matters are changes in behavior, changes in sanitation, as well as the discovery of vaccines. That means that, as a third point, that clinical medicine throughout human history actually had a very small role in improving vital statistics, particularly life expectancy, as compared to improved standards of living, public health measures, including vaccine, of course, and ecological and evolutionary dynamics that lead to the fact that over time, infectious diseases tend to become more harmless. That means there's a coevolution between the host and the pathogen. Now, many of those measures, standards of living, public health measures, are tied to the way cities are run, cities are organized, and cities develop through time. So we also see a crucial role in the changing patterns of cities as the primary cause in affecting vital statistics such as life expectancy through time. Of course, doctors did have an effect on the quality of life in terms of treating patients, particularly treating patients with chronic diseases. But as we have already mentioned, this function of treating and managing so-called systemic diseases, doctors are really good at, is increasingly becoming unsustainable today. And this is a major problem of our healthcare system, also again linked in particular to city life. Now, if we look back in the history of medicine, we start with Hippocrates in the 5th century BC, and he had basically a view of health and disease that was rooted in a balance. In his case, the balance of the 4 humors that you see here in the diagram, and health in this context basically means everything is in balance. Disease means something is out of balance. And the function of the doctor is basically to restore the balance. Now, this is an explanation for disease on an individual basis. But if you already see that those 4 humors and their associated concepts are also tied to environmental factors, hot, dry, wet, and cold in particular. Now, if you then think in the Hippocratic system about epidemics, so not an individual disease that is caused by an imbalance, but an epidemic that might affect a huge number of people, which of course Hippocrates and his contemporaries did experience, then the explanation here was that epidemics are caused by the environment, basically by an imbalance of airs, waters, and places of those features like hot, cold, wet, and dry. The Hippocratic system, of course, went through certain modifications, and the most important one we can see in the Hellenistic period, where Alexandria became the center of the civilized world, in particular the Library of Alexandria. But what you also see here on this map is the conquest of Alexander the Great going all the way to India. Now, this had an important impact on the development of medicine, particularly the treatment of diseases, because it brought together a whole range of different systems of what often is called traditional or folk medicine. In particular, it led to an expansion of known drugs, particular plant-based drugs, that brought together the insights of ancient Egypt all the way into Africa, India, with trade routes to China, and so on. All of that was collected in centers of learning such as Alexandria, and medical treatises that detailed the use of various medicinal plants sprung up and were written. Another development in the history of medicine, of course, is tied to the Roman Empire, where we see the first emergence of structured military hospitals throughout the Roman Empire. Those were mainly devoted to surgery, with the obvious goal to restore soldiers. But the Romans are also known for a first attempt to make cities less dangerous by improving hygiene and sanitation. We see this very impressively in the ruins of Pompeii, where we see bathhouses devoted to hygiene and sanitation, as well as in Rome itself. Here you have a picture of the Cloaca Maxima, the canalization, basically trying to get rid of all the waste and sewage out of the city of Rome. Now, from then it's downhill for a couple of centuries, and the major reason for that is tied to the emergence of Christianity. In a slightly provocative way, I refer to Christianity as a doomsday sect within Judaism. That was soon recast in a little more palatable fashion or Hellenistic fashion by St. Paul. But what is the major effect of Christianity on medicine has to do with the fact that Christianity initially focused on the afterlife. So this life was seen as a necessary but not very pleasant passage to a better life past death. Now, of course, within such a system, disease is not necessarily something you focus on, because it only would prolong a miserable existence in this life anyway. Now, that's certainly slightly provocative, but still true. And this is paired with the decline of the Roman Empire that was actually brought about by multiple reasons, including periods of famine, plague, and disease, as well as the resulting economic turmoil. As a consequence of this, the Roman Empire gradually disintegrated, and as you might know, under Constantine the Great and his mother, who was a Christian, Christianity, with the Edict of Milan in 313, was actually established as the state religion of the Roman Empire, particularly the Eastern Empire. Why is this important? Well, Christianity spread, but together with Christianity, a different form of medicine also spread, because St. Helena also was the foundress of the first hospital as a care for the sick. And this model of a hospital tied to the Christian notion of compassion also spread throughout the Roman Empire. Now, here you see basically an illustration that captures what happened over the next roughly 1,000 years, helpless doctors and the power of faith. It sets up a dichotomy between what can be done through intervention, medical intervention, or what can be done through the role of faith. Now, it wasn't all bad. Hospitals spread based on the model of St. Helena, but monasteries, in particular the Benedictine monasteries, first one founded by St. Benedict in Monte Cassino around 529, began to take on the legacy of the Library of Alexandria by basically also collecting knowledge, translating texts from Greek and also Arabic into Latin, making this kind of knowledge available. One of the texts that they translated had to do were those Materia Medica books that basically compiled the known knowledge about medicinal plants, and that led to the establishment of medical gardens tied to the monasteries and tied to the hospitals in the monasteries. So what we see here is basically a gradual emergence of a symbiosis of knowledge, hospitals, as well as what we would call the pharmaceutical industry, in this case in the form of agricultural medical gardens. There's a big problem with the hospitals that had to do with the inadvertent consequences of Christian compassion. There were many sick people and there were a few beds. And you might immediately imagine what's wrong with that picture if you put a variety of sick people together in those beds, many of which have infectious diseases. You only spread the disease and basically further their demise. But on the other hand, that also means you further the passage of those people to the afterlife. Now, what's really important in the history of medicine is that in that period of the Middle Ages, particularly from the 6th, 7th century onwards, up to the 11th, 11th and 13th centuries, most of the further development of medical knowledge did not happen in the Western world, in the Christian world, but actually happened in the Arab world. And this map basically shows the spread of the Arab influence during the Middle Ages, going all the way to Spain and southern France, but also going way back into the East. So you see the major centers of learning, whether it's Alexandria, Baghdad, Cordoba, Isfahan, and so on. The European universities basically benefited from that Arab tradition because they got a boost through translations of Arab texts. In many cases, originally Greek texts were first translated to Arabic and then translated from Arabic into Latin. And a lot of that happened basically at the borders. And here you had, in several instances, whether it's Sicily or Spain, an interesting symbiosis between Arab, Christian, and Jewish worlds. The Jews already had the notion of the rabbinical schools, a gradual accumulation of knowledge through texts, and that together with a huge influx of translations from the Arabic led to the establishment of the modern universities. And interestingly enough, in terms of medicine, the earliest universities were all at the border between the Arab and the Christian worlds, whether it's Montpellier in France or whether it's universities in southern Italy and Sicily. The first emphasis in medical theory was basically an emphasis on translation and commentary, and you see a lot of those beautifully illuminated books. And you see also here the model of learning. Somebody basically reads from a book and others pay attention, and this is how knowledge was passed on. Okay, so this is a brief history of the medical developments up to the Middle Ages. Now what we want to do next is basically think about the effect of diseases. What we have here is a small sample of major epidemics for known history, and you can see epidemics are pretty widespread and have dramatic consequences. Smallpox in the Roman Empire, the 2nd century, 5 million dead. The bubonic plague, already in the Roman Empire, 25 million dead. The bubonic plague of the Middle Ages, the so-called Black Death, in the 14th to 16th century, roughly 100 million dead. At its height, basically within a 3-year period, 25% of the population of Europe died, mostly in cities. Dramatic consequences for the economy as well as for the further development of European culture. And so on. In later periods, you see cholera throughout the 19th century with very dramatic consequences, as well as the influenza pandemics that were global epidemics, killing several millions of people, in particular the pandemic of 1918 with roughly 75 million dead. More recently, a very prominent pandemic is the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So what is an epidemic? An epidemic in the modern sense, not in the Hippocratic sense, is basically a widespread infectious, is widespread, is infectious, acts very quickly, has serious symptoms across a deme. A deme is basically a word for population. It's epidemic if it's within a population, it's pandemic if it crosses population boundaries and spreads throughout the world. Look at influenza as an example of a recurring pandemic. What we see is that the virus behind it, this has various subtypes, a virus that has a reservoir in pigs and birds, and that recombines very rapidly. So this is why you get a yearly new influenza pandemic, because a new subtype emerges through co-infection, mostly in an animal host, that creates a combination of factors that are new and therefore not really covered by existing vaccines or the immune system. And once that enters the human population, it spreads very rapidly across the globe. You all know the individual symptoms: fever, headache, coughing, basically pain. It can be prevented with two types of measures, most effectively vaccines. Once we know what's the prevailing subtype is, a vaccine can get developed and get displayed across the globe, but also simple measures such as washing hands and don't touch your face. Treatment, basically wait it out. The reason for its spread is that we live in dense populations, we have rapid transportation systems, we have a pretty bad social behavior vis-a-vis the spread of vaccines, but also the influenza virus is airborne. So if you cough, it enters the air, it touches on surfaces such as knobs of doors, you pick it up, you touch your eyes, you touch your nose or your mouth, and the virus can enter. It's a rapidly evolving disease, as I said before. It has a very fast mutation rate on top of the recombination rates through co-infection, and it spreads from animals to humans. So this is basically the recipe that we can never get rid of this infectious disease, because it has multiple animal hosts. Since it weakens the patient rather dramatically, it is a very dangerous infectious disease because it can then enable secondary infections, in particular bacterial infections, and the majority of deaths are actually attributed to the secondary infections and not the primary infection of the influenza virus. This raises a couple of issues, particularly in cities. In case such as influenza, where we have a vaccine, should people be required to have vaccines? There's a lot of opposition against vaccines, which is basically all bogus and nonsense, but can we force people to be vaccinated? Since any infection basically enables a virus or bacteria to spread from patients to patient, that means from person to person, and one effective way of preventing this is through quarantine. Should sick people be isolated or quarantined? In addition, if you have a very dangerous pandemic, it raises issue about healthcare providers. Are they required to treat patients in epidemics, even if this means a highly elevated risk to themselves? I mean, we have some potentially very dangerous infectious diseases lurking at our boundaries. Can we force our healthcare providers to basically put themselves on the front line, even if that means a very high likelihood of being infected and potentially dying? And another one, particularly in the post-Snowden NSA area, a lot of concern has been raised through the sharing of data, but in this case, sharing national data with global institutions is absolutely crucial in devising effective policies. yet many nations still resist sharing their data. There's a culture of cover-up and trying to basically avoid coming clean with what's going on the ground, and all of that just leads to an increase of the risk of a global pandemic of unforeseen proportions. But how can we force governments to share national data? Now, another example, the bubonic plague, you're aware of it, the Black Death of the Middle Ages, had huge social implications. There are many things that could be said about it. You have one of your reading that basically talks about a very recent example of the application of modern technology, ancient DNA technology, to basically sequence the genome of the bacteria that caused the bubonic plague. I want to add one other story to it that ties the bubonic plague to cities and the development of cities and the role cities play within larger political and economic organizations. So you all might know that the bubonic plague came from the steppe of Asia. It came through a trade route. It started in a harbor in the Black Sea. It spread by ships to all kinds of harbor cities in Europe. So there you see already how trade that's tied to cities, in this case harbors, cities, became the pattern that determined the spread of this disease. Once it moved inland from the harbor cities and across the European continent, it did not do that in a random fashion. It basically traveled across the old system of Roman roads. And there you see an interesting consequence. Now this is a very long-term historical effect, because the way the Roman Empire was built, supporting mainly the city of Rome and its other major cities, you get a system of roads that create basically the ecological and economical footprint of those cities, where trade flows and resources flow into the city. This infrastructure was established to maintain a whole empire, and many centuries later, this very same infrastructure provided the way and the venues for the spread of the bubonic plague. By the way, the bubonic plague is not extinct. It has a reservoir in rodents. It periodically affects humans. If for the German students here, if you come to Arizona and we travel to northern Arizona, this is actually one of the reservoirs of the bubonic plague, rodents in the Colorado Plateau. But don't worry, it's unlikely that you get affected, and if you do, antibiotics can basically take care of it. Now, another important epidemic in human history is smallpox. Smallpox is important because it actually led to the discovery of vaccines. And smallpox is also important because it's the one infectious disease that has been eliminated, more or less, from the surface of the planet, and it could be eliminated because it only has a human host. So a vaccination campaign started in the second half of the 20th century, basically eliminated smallpox. It is an extremely nasty and also deadly disease. In an epidemic, it affects about 90% of the people, and the mortality rate is about 25 to 35%. If you are infected, there are two outcomes, death or long-lasting immunity, but that often comes with marks, the so-called pock marks, can also result in blindness. The mode of transmission is mostly airborne particles. What was noticed early on is that there was an old practice of rather uncertain origins. It came into the West largely through Turkey, that was called variolation. That people actually would go and take scabs from the fluid of those pustules and applied them to healthy patients, which resulted generally in a mild infection with a much lower death rate, but then led, of course, to the immunity. It's a vaccination with a live virus, basically. It was slowly adopted, there was lots of prejudice against it, and it was mostly performed not by doctors, but by folk healers. Edward Jenner then noticed something different, and he noticed that basically milkmaids who had been exposed to a slightly different disease, namely cowpox, also did not really get sick from smallpox. So basically, he then adopted a vaccination procedure that used the cowpox virus and gave it to people in order to protect them from smallpox. That was the origin of our modern theory of vaccination. They didn't know how the immune system worked at that time. It was all based on empirical observations. But it was a major breakthrough in the history of medicine. Now, smallpox has a very interesting history. Due to human transmission, we know that it could not really have existed in the Paleolithic. It's probably derived from one of the livestock pox diseases in the Neolithic. We see the link between cowpox and smallpox in the discovery of vaccines. We know it was there in antiquity. There are several candidates who have died from it, such as Ramses V. There is a discussion about the plague of Athens, whether it's bubonic plague or smallpox, most likely smallpox. There were two known epidemics throughout the Roman Empire, even though it's difficult to do diagnosis that far back. It clearly was in China during the 4th century based on the descriptions of the disease patterns, as well as in Japan in the 8th century. It was present at a continuous rate throughout the Middle Ages, but was then clearly overshadowed by the emergence of the bubonic plague in the 15th century. It's also an important disease in the context of the spread of the European disease pool, because the most effective weapon of Europeans in the conquest of the Americas basically was smallpox. The native populations in the Americas, both North and South America, had never been exposed to smallpox. They had no immunity. The European soldiers and colonists who came there mostly were exposed to smallpox and survived, so they had immunity. But there were, of course, plenty of outbreaks that introduced this disease into a completely virgin population with often traumatic effects. In some cases, up to 90% of the people in certain regions died of smallpox. It's also the first known case of a biological weapon in the modern sense. Jeffrey Amherst suggested in 1763 to use smallpox as a biological weapon, and it was spread through, or attempted to spread through Indian villages by dispensing blankets that basically were derived from smallpox patients. It actually worked. By the way, biological warfare was done before. It was common to, during sieges, to not just throw cannons or try to, arrows with fire, but also corpses across walls in order to trigger outbreaks of disease. Smallpox was still a major cause of death in the 18th century, and then vaccination began. And it was officially claimed to be eradicated in 1979. Of course, both the United States and the Soviet Union kept samples of smallpox, and there are various stories to what extent smallpox was actually developed into a biological weapon. Now, for the younger people among you, that might be bad news, because if that comes out, nobody is vaccinated anymore who was born after 1979. Us older people still have vaccination. Cholera is another important disease that brings us all the way back to the present. It's a waterborne disease, bacteria in the water. It drains a person. It has a different mode of transmission. So through diarrhea and vomiting and total draining, the bacteria multiplies in a person and then basically gets back into the non-treated water supply. So that was very prominent in the 19th century. There's a great story about the discovery of the disease pattern of cholera. There's a pump in London. We know all that, but we also know that it had been in Haiti after the earthquake and wreaked havoc there. And those were the conditions under which cholera thrives. The flu, we talked about it already. This is a picture of the 1918 flu, which was particularly nasty since it really affected mostly people in their prime. It didn't really kill as much old people than it killed young people in their 20s. Now, polio is another infectious disease that is still not completely eradicated, but where we made a lot of progress, largely through the development of vaccines. It was very dangerous still in the middle of the 19th century, where it affected many children. People had to be put in the so-called iron lungs. It affected an American president, Franklin Roosevelt, who had polio and for most of his life had to use a wheelchair. Polio became sort of less of a scare with the development of two different types of vaccine. The Salk vaccine, which used was a live vaccine and considered to be more dangerous, and the Sabin vaccine, which basically used a dead virus. Okay, so how do we prepare? How should we prepare against infectious diseases? This is really a big problem. And that gets us to the last part of this brief presentation, and that is global health and the role of major diseases today and its connections to cities. So those are some images of cities, different types of cities, and you can immediately see what are the conditions that lead us to worry, and really worry, because the majority of the world's population living in cities does not live in pristine cities with a skyline, as you see up on the upper left corner. They live in dangerous cities without sanitation, close to reservoirs of new emerging infectious diseases. And furthermore, if you look at this image here of a supermarket, many of our daily products come also from those regions. So this is how potentially dangerous bacteria in particular and viruses can enter those pristine environments as well. What we are talking about here is the following: the evolving nature of human infectious and parasitic diseases. Of the roughly 1,500 known species of human pathogens, roughly a third are bacteria, 200 viruses, a little over 300 fungi, then also protozoa, such as malaria, and various forms of worms. The important part is that more than 60% are so-called zoonoses. That means they jump from an animal host to a human host. And over 70% of those zoonoses in more recent times arise from interactions with wildlife. And this is the problem of those growing unsanitary cities in the tropics. They actually literally grow into the border where they encounter wildlife that might have diseases that humans have never seen before. And that's called emerging infectious diseases. We know of 58 over the last 25 years. Viruses are now significantly overrepresented in that sample. Worms are underrepresented. That might be just a matter of different speeds within which those diseases actually spread, and also that worms have more complex disease patterns. So the global health challenges posed by rapid urbanization in developing countries basically means that we have high disease transmission because we have lots of people living in close spaces, unsanitary transmission. We have those expanded eco-niches and increased areas of zoonotic emerging infectious disease risks. We have in those places major deficit in health infrastructure, such as lack of safe water, lots of toxic waste that weakens the immune system of all those people. It's a deadly cocktail. Now that's what happens in the developing countries. But then think about how we are not talking about individual cities anymore. Think about that we're basically talking about a network of cities that are connected through rapid transportation networks and trade. So whatever happens in any one of those unsanitary conditions can show up within very few hours at the doorstep of the most pristine and advanced city. Here you see a pattern of activity where we actually see a lot of those emerging infectious diseases. You see they're overrepresented in the tropics, but not just in the tropics. An example, for instance, is the spread of West Nile virus throughout the United States. So what we also see here that many of those emergent infectious diseases are borne by either arthropods, insects mostly, rodents, or others, bats turn out to be a very dangerous carrier of many emerging infectious diseases. Now, this was a brief introduction into the readings, and I'm looking forward to discussing this with you in person on Thursday. Okay.